"I don't think that will happen," I said, after I could breathe again. I've always been very good at repressing unpleasant things. "Just the same, I'll feel better when you have some sugar and food in you." Right on cue, the waitress appeared with our drinks and a basket of breadsticks. She stood with her back to me as she placed them on the table. "Are you ready to order?" she asked Edward. "Bella?" he asked. She turned unwillingly toward me. I picked the first thing I saw on the menu. I'll have the mushroom ravioli." "And you?" She turned back to him with a smile. "Nothing for me," he said. "Of course not." "Let me know if you change your mind." The coy smile was still in place, but he wasn't looking at her, and she left, dissatisfied. "Drink," he ordered. I sipped at my soda obediently and then drank more deeply, surprised by how thirsty I was. I realized I had finished the whole thing when he pushed his glass toward me. "Thanks," I muttered, still thirsty. The cold from the icy soda was radiating through my chest, and I shivered. "Are you cold?" "It's just the Coke," I explained, shivering again. "Don't you have a jacket?" His voice was disapproving. "Yes." I looked at the empty bench next to me. "Oh, I left it in Jessica's car," I realized. Edward was shrugging out of his jacket. I suddenly realized that I had never once noticed what he was wearing. Not just tonight, but ever. I just couldn't seem to look away from his face. I made myself look now, focusing. He was removing a light beige leather jacket now. Underneath, he wore an ivory turtleneck sweater. It fit him snugly, emphasizing how muscular his chest was. He handed me the jacket, interrupting my ogling. "Thanks," I said again, sliding my arms into his jacket. It was cold, the way my jacket felt when I first picked it up in the morning, hanging in the drafty hallway. I shivered again. It smelled amazing. I inhaled, trying to identify the delicious scent. It didn't smell like cologne. The sleeves were much too long. I shoved them back so I could free my hands. "That color blue looks lovely with your skin," he said, watching me. I was surprised. I looked down, flushing, of course. He pushed the bread basket toward me. "Really, I'm not going into shock," I protested. "You should be. A normal person would be. You don't even look shaken." He seemed unsettled. He stared into my eyes, and I saw how light his eyes were. Lighter than I'd ever seen them. Golden butterscotch. "I feel very safe with you," I confessed, mesmerized into telling the truth again. That displeased him. His alabaster brow furrowed. He shook his head, frowning. "This is more complicated than I planned," he murmured to himself. I picked up a breadstick and began nibbling on the end, measuring his expression. I wondered when it would be okay to start questioning him. "Usually you're in a better mood when your eyes are so light," I commented, trying to distract him from whatever thought had left him frowning and somber. He stared at me, stunned. "What?" "You're always crabbier when your eyes are black." "I expect it then," I went on. "I have a theory about that." His eyes narrowed. "More theories?" "Mm-hmm." I chewed on a small bite of the bread, trying to look indifferent. "I hope you were more creative this time, or are you still stealing from comic books?" His faint smile was mocking. His eyes were still tight. "Well, no, I didn't get it from a comic book, but I didn't come up with it on my own either," I confessed. "And?" he prompted. But then the waitress strode around the partition with my food. I realized we'd been unconsciously leaning toward each other across the table because we both straightened up as she approached. She set the dish in front of me. It looked pretty good, and I turned quickly to Edward. "Did you change your mind?" And turned quickly to Edward. "Did you change your mind?" she asked. "Isn't there anything I can get you?" I may have been imagining the double meaning in her words. "No, thank you, but some more soda would be nice." He gestured with a long white hand to the empty cups in front of me. "Sure." She removed the empty glasses and walked away. "You were saying?" he asked. "I'll tell you about it in the car. If—" I paused. "There are conditions?" He raised one eyebrow, his voice ominous. "I do have a few questions, of course." "Of course." The waitress was back with two more Cokes. She sat them down without a word this time, and left again. I took a sip. "Well, go ahead," he pushed, his voice still hard. I started with the most undemanding, or so I thought. "Why are you in Port Angeles?" He looked down, folding his large hands together, slowly, on the table. His eyes flickered up at me from under his lashes, the hint of a smirk on his face. Next. But that's the easiest one, I objected. Next, he repeated. I looked down, frustrated. I unrolled my silverware, picked up my fork, and carefully speared a ravioli. I put it in my mouth slowly, still looking down, chewing while I thought. The mushrooms were good. I swallowed and took another sip of Coke before I looked up. Okay then, I glared at him, and continued slowly. Let's say hypothetically, of course, that someone could know what people are thinking. Read minds, you know, with a few exceptions. Just one exception, he corrected, hypothetically. All right, with one exception then. I was thrilled that he was playing along, but I tried to seem casual. How does that work? What are the limitations? How would that someone find someone else at exactly the right time? How would he know she was in trouble? I wondered if my convoluted questions even made sense. Hypothetically, he asked. Sure. Well, if that someone, let's call him Joe, I suggested. He smiled wryly. Joe, then. If Joe had been paying attention, the timing wouldn't have needed to be quite so exact. He shook his head, rolling his eyes. Only you could get into trouble in a town this small. You would have devastated their crime rate statistics for a decade, you know. We were speaking of a hypothetical case, I reminded him frostily. He laughed at me, his eyes warm. Yes, we were, he agreed. Shall we call you Jane? How did you know? I asked, unable to curb my intensity. I realized I was leaning toward him again. He seemed to be wavering, torn by some internal dilemma. His eyes locked with mine, and I guessed he was making the decision right then whether or not to simply tell me the truth. You can trust me, you know, I murmured. I reached forward without thinking to touch his folded hands, but he slid them away minutely, and I pulled my hand back. I don't know if I have a choice anymore. His voice was almost a whisper. I was wrong. You're much more observant than I gave you credit for. I thought you were always right. I used to be. He shook his head again. I was wrong about you on one other thing as well. You're not a magnet for accidents. That's not a broad enough classification. You are a magnet for trouble. If there's anything dangerous within a 10-mile radius, it will invariably find you. And you put yourself into that category, I guess? His face turned cold, expressionless, unequivocally. I stretched my hand across the table, ignoring him when he pulled back slightly once more to touch the back of his hand shyly with my fingertips. His skin was cold and hard, like a stone. Thank you. My voice was fervent with gratitude. That's twice now. His face softened. Let's not try for 3. Agreed. I scowled but nodded. He moved his hand out from under mine, placing both of his under the table, but he leaned toward me. I followed you to Port Angeles, he admitted, speaking in a rush. I've never tried to keep a specific person alive before, and it's much more troublesome than I would have believed. But that's probably just because it's you. Ordinary people seem to make it through the day without so many catastrophes. He paused. I wondered if it should bother me that he was following me. Instead, I felt a strange surge of pleasure. He stared, maybe wondering why my lips were curving into an involuntary smile. Did you ever think that maybe my number was up the first time with the van, and that you've been interfering with fate? I speculated, distracting myself. That wasn't the first time, he said, and his voice was hard to hear. I stared at him in amazement, but he was looking down. Your number was up the first time I met you. I felt a spasm of fear at his words and the abrupt memory of his violent black glare that first day, but the overwhelming sense of safety I felt in his presence stifled it. By the time he looked up to read my eyes, there was no trace of fear in them. You remember? He asked, his angel's face grave. Yes, I was calm. And yet, here you sit. There was a trace of disbelief in his voice. He raised one eyebrow. Yes, here I sit, because of you, I paused, because somehow you knew how to find me today, I prompted. He pressed his lips together, staring at me through narrowed eyes, deciding again. His eyes flashed down to my full plate and then back to me. You eat, I'll talk, he bargained. I quickly scooped up another ravioli and popped it into my mouth. It's harder than it should be, keeping track of you. Usually I can find someone very easily, once I've heard their mind before. He looked at me anxiously, and I realized I'd frozen. I made myself swallow, then stabbed another ravioli and tossed it in.